Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, June 19th, 2015. And the world is in deep trouble. We're headed towards a possible breakdown of the world financial system because of the pig-headed stupidity of Merkel and the austerity ghouls around her, featuring Schäuble. And we'll get our report from Athens, if all goes well, a little bit later in the show. We also have a very disappointing and sad development on the ideological front. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's focus for a second on Ukraine and Russia, the big strategic picture. The problem we have here is the continuing bellicosity and constant meddling, even pinprick meddling, is very dangerous in this context. The United States has now announced that the heavy equipment, the tanks and artillery for one brigade armed forces, ground forces, that one heavy brigade is going to be pre-positioned in the Baltic states. This is supreme folly. This is enough to be a provocation. It's certainly not enough to be anything more than a tripwire on the ground. It literally makes no sense. And in response to this idiotic provocation, really more self-destructive than threatening, President Putin of Russia has said, well, if this is the case, we're going to have to increase the number of missiles that we have pointed essentially westward, and that's our compensation. And then looks at the camera and says, really, what are we supposed to do? You're constantly bringing this stuff closer and closer to our borders. We cannot simply ignore it. It's coming on and it's threatening. So pre-positioning the equipment for one brigade gets you 40 to 50 ballistic missiles. Now, whether those are intercontinental or not, I'm not exactly sure. I think some of these are going to be put into that exclave, from the Russian point of view, the exclave of Kaliningrad, right? This is the old East Prussia. That's Königsberg, Immanuel Kant's city, but that's where the missiles are, because that's the farthest west that the Russian Federation extends. So those are being put into place. Now, let's just look at the undoubted facts of the situation before we go into some interesting speculation about Secretary Kerry and what happened in Sochi, and then what may have happened to Secretary Kerry after that. Let me point out that the people in Europe are paying a lot of attention to the long and detailed interview that Putin gave to the principal Italian daily newspaper, Corriere della Sera. Corriere della Sera has just had a new boss put in. The director, or the old director is out, the new director is in. And this interview was conducted on the 6th of June, 2015. So what? Almost 2 weeks ago. And it's continuing to have many implications in the European political situation. Putin says to Corriere della Sera, this is their headline, I am not an aggressor, this is a summary, but I'd like to have a treaty arrangement with Europe, and I've got to have parity with the United States. Okay. Putin goes on to say, we will develop our offensive potential, and we will have to think about systems that can overcome the U.S. anti-missile defense. And he's pointing to the fact that the U.S. denunciation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty has forced him into a logic of meeting these U.S. advances or threats, as he sees them, through corresponding countermeasures on the Russian side. Now, this is interesting because, remember, there's a Russian-Italian special relationship, right? It goes way back, but just in more recent years, right? In the 1960s, the very reactionary Dr. Valletta of Fiat put a large truck plant and automobile plant into southern Russia, right? This is the so-called Fiat Lada, or Lada Fiat 124, also known as the Lada, and you still see those on the roads in Russia, as I noted a couple of weeks ago. So there is a special relation. Now let's see how this special relation is holding up. The relation took in recent years, very recent years, the form of a personal friendship between Putin and Berlusconi. This, as I've stressed repeatedly, this is why Berlusconi was targeted. He was a friend of Putin, and he tended to defend Putin against some of the charges that were being launched against him in the secret councils of the Eurogarchs and Eurocrats, the Brussels gang, and the rest of it. So he had to go. That's why there was a coup d'etat in November 2011. The International Monetary Fund, Monti, Goldman Sachs, all of them involved in ousting Berlusconi. But now let's look at the newspaper that tends to reflect Berlusconi, the one that supported him the most among the main ones. That is Il Giornale. Now, there's no love lost by them on me, right? They have slandered me because of 9/11 and some other things. Okay, fine. So let's just take a look at what's going on more recently. Here's a columnist of Il Giornale, Marcello Foa, and he says Putin is basically right. And he stresses in international relations, you've got to get the big picture, the strategic vision, and then you can actually evaluate the details. So he quotes at some length of his own experience, first of all. He says he's been covering Russia for the past 25 years. And he says, in these 25 years, in effect, I have never, ever had to cover a single international crisis provoked by the Kremlin. No. Instead, what I saw was the progressive and often passive pulling in of the horns by Moscow. In other words, going to smaller scale activities in geostrategy, and at the same time, though, the development of a new Russia starting in 2000, using the increased prices of oil and other natural resources, and that Russia was mainly concerned with trying to gain prosperity. Now, long interview, he wants to quote the following. Putin says, Russia never speaks in conflictual tones, and we never do that with anybody or about any of these questions. And he says, he cites Prince von Bismarck, right, 150 or 125 years ago. What is important is not the talk, but the potential. And then he says the military expenditures of the United States are superior to the military expenditures of all the rest of the world put together, and those of NATO are 10 times more than the Russian Federation. Russia has practically no military bases abroad. The Russian policy is not global, offensive, or aggressive. You should publish in your newspaper the map of the world showing all the U.S. military bases and ours, and you'll see the difference. Back in a moment, Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. We're just going through this highly interesting interview by Putin to the Italian newspaper Milan Corriere della Sera. That was the 6th of June. And the echoes are continuing here. Il Giornale, different paper, right? More right-wing, more Berlusconi. But nevertheless, the line is, Putin is basically right. This is now a common theme around Europe, and we're going to see how this moves the entire process. Is there reason to fear the Russian bear? Well, Putin says, look at the facts. We haven't been pushing our bases in any direction, and instead NATO has been expanding to the east. We have not been moving in any direction. We have not been expanding in any direction. It's rather the NATO infrastructure that keeps getting closer and closer to us. Corriere then asks Putin, do you deny that there's a threat to NATO? And he says, only an insane person, only a lunatic, or someone who's dreaming, right? A somnambulist could imagine that Russia could ever attack NATO. To come forward with this idea has no sense. It's completely baseless. Maybe somebody has an interest in feeding this kind of fear. I can only suppose it. I imagine, he says, I don't think the U.S. wants Russia and Europe to get along well. But anyway, Russia is forced to respond. We don't know what they're doing or why. We know what they're doing, but we may not know why. So we have to respond in these ways. So he says, let me tell you, there's no reason to fear Russia. The world has changed to such a degree that today reasonable people cannot imagine a military conflict on such a vast scale. We have other things to do, other things on our agenda, I guarantee you. And then this Il Giornale center-right Italian commentator says, these are the words of a leader who is not looking for conflict. It is clear, he goes on, that Putin is waiting for nothing more than to be able to close off this crisis with the United States and to get back to being considered an economic partner on the global scale. There is no new imperial Russia. There is a Russia that is attempting to get allowed back in, readmitted to the international community, and to be able to participate once again in the G8. To find a deal solution on Ukraine is not difficult, but you've got to want to find it. And this is the president. And the Corriere has also carried the comments. The former Italian president, Giorgio Napolitano, ex-president now, right, the guy who essentially piloted Berlusconi out of office. Even Napolitano, writes this commentator, even a hardcore Atlanticist, a hardcore NATO backer like Giorgio Napolitano, has certified the good faith of Moscow based on what Putin had told him in 2013, and which Napolitano transmitted to Obama, but uselessly. Now, whoever is proceeding with intellectual honesty should rather inquire, what are the geostrategic objectives that the United States is surreptitiously, and in my opinion, recklessly, dangerously attempting to obtain? Why did Obama decide to reject the outstretched hand of Putin by threatening new economic sanctions and a missile escalation in Eastern Europe? That is not the way to obtain security for the world. Okay, I think that this is a right-wing Italian commentator, and I think this is largely accurate. Now, there was then this question about Sochi, right? I pointed to it that there was this meeting in Sochi, the 6 hours of Secretary of State John Kerry, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and President Putin. And the idea was some kind of a modus vivendi, a way of getting along on questions like Syria, but also Ukraine, Donetsk, the People's Republic, and so forth. And before this was starting, right, there were these headlines, this could be a reset. And so it's about the middle of May. So it's about a month